All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Gracie Shepard, and I'm a 3L here at Georgia Law. I'd like to welcome everyone here today for, including our live stream viewers, for our 36th annual Edith House Lecture. Edith House is the first female graduate of the University of Georgia School of Law. She was a co-valedictorian of the class of 1925, which was the first class here at Georgia Law to admit women. I'd like to thank especially the Benton family who are here today. They're relatives of Edith House and here with us today. Mr. Terrell Benton Jr. is a 1963 graduate of the University of Georgia School of Law. His wife, Jo Benton, is a first cousin of Edith House. They're joined at the lecture by their children and grandchildren. And this is Usha Rodriguez, Associate Dean for Faculty Development here at Georgia Law.
Thanks, Gracie. Gracie is the Vice President of the Women's Law Students Association here at the University of Georgia, and also is a favorite student of mine. We'd like to thank our co-sponsors, the Edith House Lecture Fund and Athens Made, an Athens-based nonprofit dedicated to educating, supporting, and promoting homegrown brands, entrepreneurs, and creative professionals right here in Athens, Georgia. Both of these groups have provided generous financial support to help make this lecture possible. Most of all, of course, we'd like to thank our distinguished guest, former Deputy Attorney General Sally Yates, a woman who seems to need no introduction these days. Sally, we could spend almost half of our allotted time just detailing your many accomplishments.
Let's just skip all that conversation.
All right, fine. I will just highlight that you spent 27 years at the Justice Department, first as an U.S. Attorney General, as a U.S. Attorney here in Atlanta, and then as Deputy Attorney General, and briefly as Acting Attorney General for the United States. We're going to start our conversation now then, without further ado, and I think Gracie's going to lead off with some questions about law school.
I am. Okay. So Sally, I am wrapping up my last semester here at Georgia Law, hopefully graduating this spring. And I would just like to ask you, as an alumna, what are some of the things that you've taken from your time here at Georgia Law?
First of all, let me say thanks to everyone you all have already thanked for putting this on here today. I'm so excited to be back here at the University of Georgia Law School, which actually is my point. And at the risk of losing all credibility with you right out of the gate, I have to tell you, I loved law school. And I know that sounds a little twisted, but I actually loved law school. I loved the academic side of it. I really liked the Socratic method. I mean, I thought that was fun and exhilarating. I know maybe it's with the benefit of time and distance now I find it fun and exhilarating. I liked the way that you learned to think in law school, which was a different way from undergraduate and otherwise. But actually, the thing I loved most about law school was my experience with my classmates here. When I talked with other friends who are lawyers and I'd tell them how much I loved law school, they look at me like I'm out of my mind, and they then tell me about what their experiences were like. Here, and I'm assuming that it's the same way, the reports are that it's the same way. It certainly was competitive, but not in a cutthroat kind of way. Example, you're in class, you're called on, you either have just the brain cramp where you can't remember the answer or you hadn't done the reading. A lot of law schools, people are really cheering at your failure. I mean, because they feel like that makes them look better that you didn't know the answer. Exactly opposite here. I mean, you'd be sitting there and there would be people behind you trying to kind of whisper the answers to you and help you. Now, you have to be careful who you listen to sometimes. But that's a completely different kind of thing. And I think that kind of mindset of, of rigorous academics, of being competitive, but at the same time, being supportive of your colleagues, that's what carries over in how you practice law later too. And that's what makes the difference in what's a really pleasant way to make a living and what can be pretty miserable. So
that's a great answer.
I'll try to
that's a
shorter
great
answer.
No. Yeah, I would definitely agree that I think that's still the case here at Georgia Law. Yeah. So that's exciting. Are there any lessons from specific professors that you recall?
Oh gosh, it's hard to pick one out without then offending all the others that you don't mention. But it's interesting. I was talking with a law school classmate of mine last week, and we both talked about Dean Ellington. He was my civil procedure professor. And, there are some professors who scare the hell out of students. I mean, that's sort of the way that they teach. And they do it through fear, and it's the fear of being humiliated that's sort of the club that's used there. That's not how Ron Ellington taught. But when he walked in the room, the whole room would go silent, completely silent the moment that he walked in. But it wasn't because we were afraid of him, because Dean Ellington never tried to embarrass anyone in the room. It was rather that we all just respected him so much. He knew, first of all, his expertise was off the charts. He knew it inside and out. He was going to be, obviously, the most prepared person in the room. But he treated all of us with respect. Even when you had that brain cramp moment that you didn't know the answers and were embarrassing yourself. And so, that I think is a life lesson beyond just sort of how to be a law school professor in terms of the most effective way to motivate people. I don't think is through fear of humiliation, but rather through engendering respect. And you certainly couldn't have anything more than respect for Ron Ellington.
Definitely. I guess jumping off of that a little, do you have a favorite class in law school, or do you have a specific cold call or class memory that comes to mind?
I'm sure I have blocked out of my memory all of those moments when it didn't go so well. When I was, this same friend that I was talking to, it's interesting, I remember the names of all of my professors from my first year of law school. I can't tell you but a couple of names from all of college that I still remember at this point. But those first year professors, there's something about your first year section and that sort of boot camp mentality that you have of being in this sort of crazy, strange new world together. But we were also incredibly lucky to have a great group of professors, particularly my first year. And each one of them was different. Tom Eaton was my torts professor. And
mine too.
Oh, yeah. And, I can remember actually sort of starting out the year and thinking I knew where I was philosophically, but sort of ending up at a very different place by the end of the year. And oftentimes that would happen just within the course of a class because of sort of the different nuances that Professor Eaton would be able to point out. And Paul Kurtz and the passion that he brought to con law. You gotta love that. Somebody who is feeling it with the kind of intensity that he does and able to express just how important that is to our country. So there wasn't any one particular, it was really sort of more the tapestry that they all created together for just an amazing first year experience.
Gotcha. What do you think makes the University of Georgia different, and what makes Georgia law different?
Well, I guess the primary thing, would be what I'd already mentioned in terms of sort of the collegiality. That word sometimes sounds kind of trite. But, it wasn't just that we were nice to each other. These were fun people to hang out with. We had a good time together. We went on spring breaks together. We have stayed friends now. And I think that the relationships that you build here, from talking with my other friends who went to different law schools, it's different from there. That's not to say that they don't carry friendships with them, but the kind of experiences that people have here, plus the number of people oftentimes who are staying in Georgia to practice, you end up, still running into the people that you went to law school with. And that sort of creates a continuity that doesn't necessarily exist in other schools.
That makes sense. And I guess zooming out a little of just law school in general, are there any opportunities or trends that you see in law school now that you wish you would have had access to when you were in law school?
Well, there's so much more experiential learning now than there was when I was in law school. We certainly had some things. There was a prosecutorial clinic, there was a defense side, there were a couple of things, but nothing like the opportunities that you all have now. And I think that's a really good thing, because sometimes the class that's really interesting, the subject matter that's fun and compelling from an academic standpoint, is a real snooze to practice, but you don't really know that unless and until you actually see what lawyers do in that area. And so I think it's terrific that you have so many more opportunities to be able to dip your toe into different areas and try things on and see how they fit.
Gotcha. As I'm about to leave the nest, what do you wish that you would have known when you were in my shoes about to leave law school?
Oh, there are a million things, I bet. But, I guess I would say the first thing is you don't have to have it all figured out right now. We put such pressure, I'll say on kids these days, that's sort of showing my age now, but we put such pressure on students in high school to know what it is they want to be when they graduate from college, or in law school to know what kind of law they want to practice. How the heck would you know when you haven't even been to law school yet what it is you want to do? And when I was in law school, I had absolutely no thought whatsoever of becoming a prosecutor. None. Didn't really even enter my mind. Wasn't particularly interested in criminal law and didn't take many criminal law classes, which probably would frighten some of you given the job I ended up with later, but that little on-the-job training after that. But it was through, actually, my sister-in-law, Dorothy Kirkley, who is here, who had been in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Atlanta and had been the acting U.S. Attorney there, and from talking with her and hearing about her experience when I was in private practice in Atlanta, that I thought, that sounds like that would be something interesting to try out, having no idea that it was going to become not just what I did for the vast majority of my professional life, but really my passion and what I really believe in. And had I sort of stayed locked into what I thought I wanted to do when I graduated from law school, I wouldn't have taken the chance to try to experience something else. And so to the extent, if you have it all figured out now and you know what you want to do, that's great. But I guess what I would say is stay open to other opportunities and to keep your eyes open to other experiences, because you never know what else might be out there that's a path that you would enjoy as well.
So on that note, do you have any specific advice for young people or young lawyers who do know that they're interested in public service?
Ooh. I always hate the advice stuff because it's, I don't mean I hate the question, I hate sort of giving it. Well, look, I am obviously a huge believer in public service. I've got to tell you, if you're going to be a lawyer, there's no career that is more rewarding than in devoting yourself, at least for some portion of your legal career, to public service. Look, there's nothing wrong with making money. All of us like it. That's not a problem. But there is something really compelling about the satisfaction that you get from feeling like that you're doing something that actually has a positive impact in the world. And it doesn't mean you have to be a prosecutor. There are lots of ways to engage in public service. Obviously on the criminal defense side, but they're also in, whether it's environmental work or State Department work, there are lots of ways, and it doesn't even have to be in government service. There are other ways to engage in public service beyond going to work for the government. But after telling you I don't like to give advice, I'm about to. I would say I actually think we all, at some point in our lives, have an obligation to do some type of public service. That doesn't mean you have to go work for the federal government, but it does mean, I think, that we all have an obligation to get outside ourselves a bit, and particularly lawyers who have opportunities and abilities and skills that regular people out there don't have. I think that we all have an obligation to take this special opportunity that we have as lawyers and to try to use it for the greater public good at some point in our career.
That's a great answer.
Well, thank you.
And at this point, I think Dean Rodriguez has some questions for you just about the legal profession.
Okay.
Yeah, and I was going to lead out with an advice question too.
Okay.
And but I wanted to ask actually a follow-up to Gracie's question. So was it scary for you to make that move? Because I've talked with former students who are contemplating, and they always say, well, professor, this is so risky, to make this change.
Yeah, I got to tell you, I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. And this was back in Atlanta. I will date myself now. It was 1989. And this was before many people from big firms went to the U.S. Attorney's office. So there were a couple of people in our office who had been at a big firm before, but many of them came from DA's offices or state AG offices, so they had criminal prosecutorial experience. I had none. And way back then, there was no training program in the office. I showed up, I was put in the white collar section. They showed me to my office. There was this stack of files on the desk, and my supervisor looked at me and said, well, call me if you've got any questions. And she left, and you don't want to admit you don't have any clue what you're doing, so she left. I closed the door, and I pulled out the Federal Rules of Criminal Procedure, and I started reading from Rule 1 to say, okay, so how does this whole thing work here? And read the rules through, tried to read the cases. I knew somebody who had been in the office before because I didn't want to raise my hand and tell everybody I had no idea what I was doing. So I had to go do an arraignment, which in a case that had already been charged that they gave me. I didn't even know what an arraignment looked like or what you did or what questions you asked. So I called him, and Bob sort of gave me sort of a rundown of it. And then I started on my own trying to just go watch people doing various things, and found some people in the office that I could confess to that I had never seen any of this before. So yeah, it was a little scary then. Not only that I was leaving the safety of affirmative practice that I liked. I mean, I didn't leave it because I hated it. I left it because I thought this sounded more interesting and more rewarding. I thought I was going to go back to private practice after just a few years. I thought I'll go to the U.S. Attorney's Office, stay a few years, go back to the firm. And I was totally unprepared with how taken I would become with the mission of the Department of Justice. And I know this sounds corny, but the fact that I represented the people of the United States, and it wasn't about two companies fighting over money. And I got to believe I was on the right side every single time. Not everybody always agreed with me as to whether I was on the right side, and that's okay too, but as a lawyer, that's a remarkable luxury and a real privilege. So that's how, from what I thought would be a few years, it ended up being 27.
It doesn't sound corny at all.
No.
So what do you think, this is sort of a follow-on question, is the role of the lawyer in the federal government? What do you expect of such a lawyer?
Well, there are lots of different kinds of lawyers in the federal government. I mean, obviously 3 branches, so the role of a law clerk, for example, to a judge is different than a lawyer to a congressional committee, that's different to a lawyer in a federal agency, that's different to a lawyer at the Department of Justice. Each one of them obviously has different roles, but what is appreciably different than any kind of private role is that in all of those settings, while you may technically work for a judge or for a particular agency head, you really work for the people of the United States. And everyone takes the same oath. Every single federal employee in all of government takes the same oath. And it's not to a particular agency or agency head or to anybody else, it's to uphold the Constitution of the United States. And so in that sense, we're all working for the same client, but you just have different roles depending on what your job is in different parts of federal government.
So I told you I was going to get back to the advice question. And sort of, some of it stems from looking back at your career over time. How have you seen the role of women in the legal profession change over time? And would your advice to Gracie as a young lawyer be different because she's a woman?
I think Gracie's got it figured out.
Yeah.
I'm not worried about Gracie. I think she's going to be just fine.
I think that's right.
Well, yeah, I mean, it has changed dramatically from the time that I started practicing in 1986 to where it is now. That's not to say that there's not still more improvement to be had, because I think that there is. There's more to be done there. But when I started, I went to King and Spalding when I graduated from law school, and there was one female litigation partner in the entire firm. One. There was, you could probably count on one hand the number of female litigation associates in the firm. Women were working in other parts of the firm, but not really in litigation. That was kind of the old boys network then. So that was sort of one extreme over the course of my career, to the point when I was at the Department of Justice and when I was Deputy Attorney General, and I was in a meeting in the AG's conference room, and this is when Loretta Lynch was AG, and it's a great big huge conference room table, beautiful regal room, people all around the sides, because there's always staffers that come to these meetings, and so there's staff members that are lined up on the side, and I'm there, and when we get up, my principal deputy turns to me and he said, "Did you realize I was the only man in the room?"
Wow.
And I looked and said, "Actually, Matt, no, I didn't even notice." And so I guess that sort of says two things there. One, that Matt was the only guy in the room at a meeting, and this was sort of top-level people about a very, very difficult issue that we were facing in the department, that it was all women there. But secondly, the fact that, maybe I'm just not very observant. I've always known I would be a terrible witness. But that I didn't even notice. That just didn't really even register to me. It wasn't something particularly important at that moment. So, that's come a long way. But there's still more to be done, I think.
So what do you think about the Me Too movement and the conversation that it's engendered?
I think it's about time.
Yeah.
Yeah, look, I think for decades and decades, women have been subjected to various things, from the boorish comment in the workplace to on one end to sexual assault on the other end. And then there's all sorts of stuff in between. In years past, I can remember the days, and I certainly, I was lucky. I was never subjected to anything very serious. But nobody, you're in a law firm, or you're in particularly an environment that's mostly a male-dominated environment. Nobody really wanted to be that person who was the one who was rocking the boat. Mm-hmm. If you're talking an assault or something, that's one thing, but the kind of harassment that women have put up with for a long time, nobody wanted to be that person. And I think one of the things that's so important about Me Too now is that instead of women having to feel sheepish about speaking out about it, instead I'm hoping now women would feel sheepish not to speak out about it. And what I also hope is that men would recognize that this is not just the responsibility of women to raise their hands when something out of bounds is happening, but it's equally the responsibility of men. Mm-hmm. When they observe things like that, to call it out, whether it's in a public setting or a private setting, because nobody should have to endure that, particularly in a workplace setting. Now, that being said, I'll also say I think that we all have to recognize, though, that there is a spectrum of conduct, and there is the boorish comment to the sexual assault, obviously, on one end, but then also situations where you have someone who's in a position of power over a woman and is harassing. That's obviously very serious. But I think that we need to be able to have the conversation about this, and while I think every one of those actions should have some type of consequence, I do think that we have to make sure that the consequence is proportional to what the conduct is. If we don't, I'm afraid if we're going to go too far one way, and we're going to lose the momentum that we have right now. So I think people are really uncomfortable talking about this, and you see men are really uncomfortable talking about it. Sometimes I think they're afraid they're going to say the wrong thing. I think it's going to take a little time as people start working through it, but I think organizations need to really be looking at how they're handling these issues and what kind of structures and processes they have set up to address situations when women are being subjected to conduct that they shouldn't be, so that a woman doesn't have to make this difficult decision of whether to push back, but rather there's a structure there that's in place that makes it clear that this is not the kind of conduct that's tolerated in this environment, and there's an easy way for a woman to be able to speak out about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're talking more and more with our women law students about these issues, and our male law students too, right? It's sort of an issue for all of us.
So what do they say?
They say it's hard, right? They say that the boorish comment, right, that's sort of a little off, but you're not sure what to do, and you really want this job. They're tough questions when it's not clearly on the end of the spectrum where it's actionable, right?
Yeah. don't know, somebody in a job interview is making the boorish comment? That's, yeah.
No, but it's more like
I'm drawing a line on that.
Yeah, but it's more like the summer, the summer associate
Yeah,
position
yeah,
where,
yeah.
and yeah, I mean, they're hard questions.
Yeah, they are.
They really are. Well, so I was going to ask you about what the guys can do to try to help, but I think you sort of answered that as just be allies, right?
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow. Well, good information. I think we're going to shift a little and talk to you about your role as a lawyer personally. Okay. What were your considerations or what mattered to you as you were deciding whether to have the Department of Justice enforce the travel ban?
We're going to go right to that. Okay. We had a little lead up. All right. Well, first, sort of a little backdrop here of sort of how I came to be in this position to make that decision. It's a tradition at the Department of Justice that during the shift in administrations that the Deputy Attorney General stays on in the next administration until the new Attorney General is confirmed. And that's for really good reasons. Most any agency you want there to be continuity, but given the really critical national security and public safety role that the Department of Justice has, it's particularly essential at DOJ. And so Eric Holder had done it into the Bush administration. I was happy to do it. But there's this other tradition as well during that time, and that is that nothing is supposed to really happen during that time. It's the tradition is that everything stays status quo, that there are no new initiatives out of the White House, that like I wouldn't go haul off and do some like Obama era kind of initiatives during the time I was acting AG, that everything just is on hold and stays status quo until the new AG is there. And so actually my chief of staff, I lost all of my staff. I was able to keep Matt, one person with me, but otherwise it's all Trump appointees that are there during this time and the career people. So my chief of staff was leaving and she told me, because this was supposed to be such a a laid back time, she said, you're going to have time for a lot of long boozy lunches. Joking with me about this, but not exactly given sort of the Mike Flynn situation and this that was happening contemporaneously. So sort of that's the backdrop for it's Friday the 27th, January 27th, about 5 in the afternoon. And I'm heading back to Atlanta because my husband is going to be recognized in an event in Atlanta on Saturday night. And I'm in the car, and after I've left, Matt calls me and says, I was just on the New York Times website. It's like I leave, so he then starts catching up on the news. I was just on the New York Times website, and I read that President Trump has done some sort of travel ban for Muslim-majority countries. That's how we found out at the Department of Justice about the travel ban that we had to have lawyers in court to defend against within hours as people were coming off of planes, because there were folks who literally, planes had taken off, the executive order is signed, and they're not going to be admitted. So we've got to have people in court to address these. So we spent the weekend trying to get our arms around what this travel ban was, what the president was seeking to accomplish here, who it covered and who it didn't cover. Because at that time, this was travel ban 1. We're on 3.0 now, so we're a couple of travel bans past that one. But the first one, it actually applied to valid green card holders. You could be an LPR, a lawful permanent resident, and you were not allowed in the country. You could have a valid visa and you were not allowed in the country. So we were trying to figure out, who does this apply to? What are the legal challenges that have been filed? And what is our defense to this? How do we make the argument that this is both lawful with respect to the Immigration and Nationality Act and constitutional? And normally DOJ is a pretty hierarchical place, and so by the time something would get to me, it had been through 1,000 levels and memos, and people had reviewed it, and everything's boiled down. Well, there's no time for any of that. I'm literally online over the weekend reading challenges and cases, trying to get my arms around what the law is on this. And we then gathered everybody together Monday morning which included all the career people and the Trump administration people. We talked through what the challenges were and what our defenses to this would be. And I can't disclose internal deliberations on that, but I can tell you that at the end of that, I was not satisfied that the travel ban was lawful under the INA or constitutional. And I also, particularly problematically, was not at all convinced that our defense to this travel ban, that our defense had to be that religion had absolutely nothing to do with it. It's just a coincidence these are Muslim countries. Religion has nothing to do with it. I didn't believe, based on the president's statements that he had made both while he was campaigning and since he was elected, that that would be grounded in truth. And from my perspective, that then left the Department of Justice to have to advance a pretext. And the Department of Justice should never be advancing a pretext. And so the harder issue was not so much whether I was going to be part of that, because I clearly wasn't, but whether I was going to direct the Department of Justice not to defend it or whether I was just going to resign. And I grappled over that. I mean, all of this is happening in 72 hours, so there's not a whole lot of time to grapple about a lot, but over the course of the day Monday, I grappled with that and thought about resigning instead. But that felt like I'm going to protect my personal integrity if I do that, but that doesn't protect the integrity of the Department of Justice. And it didn't feel like I'd be doing my job. I mean, I wasn't the head of the civil division that was going to be in there arguing or the head of the Office of Legal Counsel. I mean, I was the acting attorney general, and my responsibility was broader than that. So I made the decision to direct the department not to defend it.
I think that's really interesting, especially in light of what you talked about earlier, the role of, a Department of Justice prosecutor representing the people of the United States. Had you ever found yourself in a similar position before where you were defending the people of the United States, but almost against the government itself?
No, because I had been a prosecutor most of my life until then. I was U.S. attorney, and we had civil, and we do civil defensive work in the Department of Justice. But no, this was a different kind of scenario than I had ever been in before. But the civil division, particularly at Main Justice, is the one that is charged with defending actions of the executive actions like this, or other actions that might be taken through agencies. That's the work of the civil division there. So certainly that's what we did at DOJ. But we had never been in a position that I was ever involved in where we believed that an executive order or an action was unconstitutional, and importantly, that we would have to advance something that wasn't true. And look, we weren't talking about some, interpretation of an arcane statute or something here. I mean, we're talking about whether our government was going to discriminate against people based on religion. That's core value stuff that seemed to me that we ought to be on the right side of that.
I'm going to interject a question without going into those, internal debates. Had you thought about this question before those 72 hours about, well, what would happen if I was asked by the president or by someone in the executive branch to do something that I wasn't prepared to defend in terms of that I thought was constitutional? Had you thought about that? Had you done some of that work personally and professionally preparing for that?
Well, interestingly, this issue came up in my confirmation hearing, because at that time, this was a different executive order that many Republicans in the Senate opposed, and the Department of Justice was defending it. And there were several senators that were all over me about your job is to say no to the president. If something's unlawful, and in fact, Senator Sessions went farther. It wasn't just unlawful, it was if there's something that would bring dishonor, I think it was, or something like that, to the Department of Justice, will you say no? Your job is to say no. Will you say no? Mm-hmm. I agreed with them. They're right. My job was to say no. They just wanted me to say no to a different president. So yeah, that had come up in that context. But candidly, no, I wasn't expecting anything to come up during this interim time because, again, nothing's supposed to happen during that time.
Yeah.
Everything is just sort of, you keep the understanding, the norm is, although many norms have been broken, but the norm is that the positions of the Department of Justice in litigation that is pending during this time would stay the same. Now, when the new Attorney General comes in, if the new AG wants to take a different position, that's a really unusual thing to do in a pending case, but he or she can do that if they want to. If they want to change a position, they can do that. But the tradition, the norm is that everything stays as it was until the new Attorney General is in place.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned norms, and it seems like every day when I wake up and I look at the news, it's sort of what's happened, what has gone on, what have I missed? How do you feel about the nature of political discourse today and what's going on?
I don't think anybody, regardless of where you are on the political spectrum right now, I don't think anybody feels good about the nature of political discourse today. It's stating the obvious to talk about how polarized we are. And I think what feels particularly troubling to me now is beyond just having different policy views. And look, people of goodwill can have different views on policy issues, but sort of ascribing bad motives to people. And that's something and putting people all in a camp and discounting, that feels different and really divisive and sort of preying on people's darkest sides and darkest instincts and using that divisiveness as a political tool. That to me is what is really destructive with our country. And look, I disagree, probably doesn't shock any of you all, with a whole lot of policy decisions of this administration. But elections have consequences, and you have to expect that there are going to be policy changes when there's a change in administrations. But I think what you don't expect is an all-out assault on democratic institutions and norms. Things like the rule of law and an independent justice department and independent courts and a free press. It's that kind of thing that I think is far more destructive and is the kind of thing that can have an impact well beyond the confines of any one administration.
And how much of that would you ascribe as blame to the president versus him being a sort of a symptom?
I don't think I think my own personal view is that he tapped into something that was already out there. But he certainly raised it to an art form. I mean, that is, I don't mean that in a good way. But I do think, the damage here, look, I think our institutions are going to hold. I mean, the courts are going to hold. I think the press is going to hold. The Department of Justice is going to hold. That's not the issue. And to me, that's a really low bar if just the question is, will the institutions survive? What we already know has taken a big hit is public confidence in institutions. When you look at any number of polls about how people feel about the court system or press, how people feel about science, things like that when the public loses confidence in their own criminal justice system, that is far more destructive than any particular policy decision to me. So that's the real damage that I think is being done. And I think it's going to be difficult to get that back. So
what gives you hope looking at this landscape that we have, this political landscape in front of us?
As much as I think, I am concerned about institutions and norms, A, we're going to get through this, and B, one of the things, there are a number of things that give me hope. People are so much more plugged in today than they ever were before to what's going on in our country. And again, regardless of where you are on the political spectrum, we ought to be able to debate policy issues. From the left and the right and Republicans and Democrats and everybody in between, we ought to be able to have real debates about those things because that's where the best answers come out of that. And, in the past, I think a lot of folks kind of thought, all of that stuff is handled, up in Washington or it's handled in the State House, and they just weren't all that tuned into it. But people are now, and young people are now, in ways that I've never seen before. I mean, look at what's happening today and tomorrow all across the country with what the students from Parkland have done. And I've got to tell you, I mean, out of just, I can't imagine unfathomable loss and grief and terror, and those kids are speaking out and are moving the nation on this issue. Now, I don't know where we end up at it, but this, common sense gun control issues, that ought to be something at least we can talk about. It's been the third rail such that people were afraid to even discuss it, even though when you look at polls, the vast majority of the American public supports a lot of common sense measures. So, I'm inspired when I see them and I see the people standing behind them. I was inspired when I saw, between travel ban one and after the first travel ban, all the people who just swarmed the airports to either demonstrate just to let people know this is who we are and what we stand for, but the lawyers that showed up at airports to be there and stay there for days on end to represent people for free because they were inspired by that. I've been doing a lot of speaking, and the number of people who come up to me and tell me they're running for office now when they never considered it before. Maybe it's a city council or a county commission or mayor, whatever. The people who are running for office now that never had any interest, that's all a good thing. Again, regardless of where you are on the political spectrum, for all of us to be more participatory, that's a good thing. So that gives me hope, and that's a silver lining, I think, out of this. I had to work hard to find a silver lining, but there's a silver lining.
I agree, definitely agree. Yeah.
Do you have any concerns about this kind of individual engagement or more enthusiasm for the democratic process kind of waning if we do sometime in the future get a more traditional head of our country?
She said it, not me. Possibly so. I mean, that's, look, I don't think any of us can stay at this kind of level for long. I mean, it's not even a 24-hour news cycle now. It's kind of like every few, in fact, I'm going to look at my phone first thing when we go back here just to see what's happened in the time that we've been out here. So I don't think any of us can really sort of sustain that. And no, I mean, we probably won't see quite that level, but sort of hitting a level set after this would be a good thing. At the same time, I also got to tell you, I think that this election was a wake-up call for a lot of people who did not, and I will include myself in this, I didn't see it coming. I think it is a wake-up call for many of us to open our eyes to the disaffection that many of our fellow Americans feel with their country, and they feel left out. And I think instead of dividing and going into corners and blaming each other, if there's any way we could use this as an opportunity to really try to get to know one another better and to figure out why people feel that way and what we can do to try to address it, it seems like that would be a more positive way forward.
That does seem that way. With all of the onslaught of just like news updates and concerns for the future, I know that even, I have a lot of stress in my life, and I can't imagine how much stress you've learned to manage on a daily basis. What are the ways that you like to manage stress or recharge?
Well, everybody feels stress in their life. I don't care what your job is or whether you work outside the home. I got to tell you, I think stay-at-home parents probably have the most stressful lives of anybody. So everybody's got stress. The stress that I experienced was just kind of more public, but it's, everybody has stress in their life. I don't know that I have any one silver bullet to that. I do the things everybody does. You hang out with your family, you exercise, you try to read and to read like fiction instead of something, instead of news. I'm trying now to wean myself and to not read news all day long and decide, I think somehow the country can get along just fine if I am not, staying up to date from hour to hour of what's happening. I think, you folks will limp along just fine without me. So I don't know that I have, I don't know that I have a magic bullet answer to that.
I'm not sure there is one. And just to kind of close this out, with our live stream, you know, imagining that there might be some high schooler or middle schooler or even, you know, college student out there who is looked at your career and the things that you've done and thinks that they might be interested in a career in the law, what would you say to them as, not a test, but like, what do you look at as being what the law is and a good guide for whether it might be a good profession for you to pursue?
Well, you know, I came reluctantly to law school, come from a family of a whole bunch of lawyers, and it was for that reason I didn't want to be a lawyer. I didn't come straight out of college. I didn't want to be a lawyer. I didn't want to be married to a lawyer, and I really didn't want many lawyer friends because that was all that I had grown up around, and instead I am a lawyer, I'm married to a lawyer, and we've got lots of lawyer friends. And I think I don't know that the law is any one thing, because there's so many different avenues and so many opportunities that you have to be able to make the world better. And look, I am going to always be an advocate for public service because, again, I was someone who didn't expect to get the bug. But once you're doing work that you feel like is not only intellectually challenging and you're doing it with colleagues that you enjoy, but you really feel like makes a difference in the world. I mean, don't you think all of us feel a need, a desire to want to be able to make the world just a little bit better? There's so many different opportunities for public service as lawyers to be able to do that. And again, such a small percentage of the population that has the chance to be able to do that, because you gotta be a lawyer for many of these things. So to take at some point in your career a chance to grab hold of that, you may find, like I did, you'll be there 27 years later because you just couldn't let go of it.
Well, please join me in thanking Sally Yates.